Cool, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I will keep this short. I am aware very much that I'm in the path of you and some refreshing beverages. My name is Matt-Wallace. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Grafana. I've been at Grafana for about 8 months. It still feels slightly weird to say that I'm a Grafana employee, but also very cool. One of the things that I'm doing a lot of in my job is talking to customers about how they move from being associated with a particular vendor to opening up more choice, and then, of course, ideally coming and sending everything to Grafana. So just before I get into the main part of the presentation, I know a lot of people have asked already how many of you know about Open Telemetry and all the rest of it. I've seen the hands going up, and actually, I'll be honest, it's a lot more people than I expected. But how many of you are actively running Open Telemetry in production for metrics, logs, and traces? Yeah, that's kind of what I expected. How many of you knew that you could use Open Telemetry for more than just traces? Excellent. Okay, that's really cool. So a lot of what we see when we talk to people about Open Telemetry is they're like, oh, well, that's just for my trace data, right? It's like, no, you can send logs, you can send traces as well. You can kind of do profiling. There's lots of stuff happening. It's a moving feast. Okay, so this is the only Eagles reference in the entire talk, I'm afraid. I ran out of time to try and fit the entire lyrics of the song in, but there we go. I'm going to talk quickly about Open Telemetry. You've had a lot of exposure to what is Open Telemetry over the last 24 hours. I will keep that brief. I'll talk a bit about auto-instrumentation and when you should use it and when you might need to do other things. I'll talk about how we can get everything or as many things that we need into whatever data backend it is you're talking about. And I'll touch briefly at the end about whether Open Telemetry is a cure for vendor lock-in, because that's often what it's sold as. And the jury's kind of out on that one. But I'll talk about that in a bit. So very quickly then, Open Telemetry. It's about, well, Austin said the other day it's not about standards, because they're not a standards governing body, but it's becoming a standard. And it is becoming the thing that people adopt. Prior to working for Grafana, I was really pushing Open Telemetry amongst my customers for a number of reasons. I used to work for a consultancy that was very generic. We used to do comparisons between various monitoring tools, making sure they were fit for purpose. And one of the reasons that I was pushing people in the direction of Open Telemetry is because if they re-instrumented their code, they could continue to send it to their current vendor, and then when they wanted to run a proof of concept, they could actually just update the Open Telemetry collector to start sending 30% of their data to the vendor they wanted to test. And they could actually repeat that inside the collector config. So I had one customer that was collecting everything via Open Telemetry, sending it to their primary, sending everything to their existing in situ vendor, and then actually sending it to 3 other vendors as well to see what it looked like within their platform. So if you're not sure whether you're going to stick with your observability provider, if you want a way to make sure that no matter who you choose in future, or certainly in the near future anyway, until someone comes up with a better idea and this gets replaced again, then this gives you that flexibility. So it's worth thinking about adopting Open Telemetry purely on that basis. It gives you that flexibility to change vendor when you want to, in a controlled manner, without asking your teams to refactor their entire code base. And one of the reasons I say to do that is because it is supported. If you look at the list of organizations that are contributing to Open Telemetry, it's not just the usual open source folks like Grafana and Elastic and all the others. It's Datadog are in there. Splunk are in there. AppDynamics are doing stuff around this, right? Those, I'm not going to call them legacy because that's unfair because they're used a lot. They're still used a lot. But those monitoring and observability tools that grew up in the age of the Java monolith are adopting Open Telemetry and are contributing to the code base. So you can still get all of your metrics into those providers and still have the flexibility to migrate away if you choose to in future. And if you read the docs for Open Telemetry, getting started with this stuff is easy, right? You install the libraries, you set your environment variables, and all the data flows into wherever it is you're sending it, and everybody's happy, and it's all rainbows and unicorns and sunlit uplands and all the rest of it, right? But actually, it's not quite that simple. So from now on, the examples I show you are going to be written in Python. There's two reasons for that. One, it's the only language I'm actually comfortable coding in. Two, I like talking about things that I actually understand. So when we're writing applications, you've got your application, and then you instrument it with Open Telemetry, and you say, OK, great, we're going to send all this data, and we're going to send it to, I'll use Grafana because it's who I work for, and you wouldn't expect me to use anyone else, and we'll just send it straight across, right? Well, not quite, because sometimes you want to send it as an input to some kind of agent, like the Open Telemetry collector, and then you want to do some kind of pipeline on that. So you might want to obscure and remove sensitive data from your logs, or you might want to say, well, actually, we've got a label on that metric that makes it really high cardinality, so we want to drop that because the higher the cardinality, the more we get billed at the end of the month, and things like that. And then finally, you'll put it into the output, and then you'll send it up to your observability platform. You don't have to do that in a lot of cases. And if you don't need to do that processing, if you don't need to do that pipeline, a lot of the time you can actually send it direct to the observability platform as it is, direct from the application. So at Grafana, if you create a new stack, as we call it, and you go and look at all of your endpoints, in amongst Prometheus and Loki and Tempo for your metrics, your logs, your traces, there's an Open Telemetry endpoint. And you can actually configure your application to send everything directly straight into Grafana Cloud. Right? There's no need for an agent. And I know that you can do that with other providers as well. Right? So that's great. We've got the application, and you've installed the libraries, and it's running, and everything's flowing to the observability platform. So we're done, right? Because we're using this thing, auto-instrumentation. And if you read through the docs, and I'll keep coming back to the docs because they do need work, and it's something that it's an area that I want to try and contribute to Open Telemetry on. You read through the docs, it's like, run this command and everything will be wonderful. And I love that concept. I really do. But this is what you have to go through in order to get auto-instrumentation working on Django. So first of all, Django, for those of you, I'm assuming most people in this room know what Django is, but for those that don't, it's a web framework. It's a fairly heavy web framework for Python, but it allows you to very quickly spin up things that have got an admin interface for all of your models in the back-end database and stuff like that. It's really useful. I use it a lot. So we install Django, and then we start a new project, and then we change into that project, and we run the database migrations, and we create a super user, and now we're into the Open Telemetry stuff. So we install the SDK, and then we install the API, and then we install the distribution and the exporter for Open Telemetry, and then we install the instrumentation for Django specifically, and then we install the exporter for Open Telemetry that sends stuff over HTTP instead of gRPC because we don't have any TLS certificates on our collector endpoint. And then we have to tell Open Telemetry where our settings module is, and then we can start to run the auto-instrumentation, right? And so eventually you get this wonderful command. Again, I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with Linux, but for those of you that aren't, this entire thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, whatever it is, that is one single command. And in this, we're saying, OK, we want to export to Open Telemetry and the console. We want to export our metrics to Open Telemetry. We want to give it a particular name. We want to send them all to this particular endpoint, and that could be running on the local machine. It could be remote. Like I say, it could be your Grafana Cloud account. We want to export using the HTTP protocol, and then we want to run the command Python manage run server, which is Django, to launch that. And this is just the dev server. This isn't even a production server. And we want Django not to automatically reload stuff, because it starts to automatically reload stuff. Open Telemetry doesn't like it, and it starts to generate bad metrics. So, simple, right? Auto-instrumentation in one easy, no, not command. But we are tracing. So this, on this side of the screen here, this is what a trace looks like. You remember on the last slide I had, where's it gone, this bit here, traces exporter, OTLP, console. You can send logs, metrics, and traces to the console, which is really handy for debugging. And this is what it looks like in the Django logs. So we've got in here, we've got the name of the trace, we've got our context and our trace IDs and our span IDs, which I know some people have covered. If you're still unsure about that, I don't have time to go into them right now, I'm afraid. But if you come and find me either on the Grafana stall tomorrow or at one of the parties tonight, I'll be happy to talk about where they come from and how they work. We've got a span kind, so we know whether this is coming from a server or a client. I'll talk a bit about those in a moment. Whether there's a parent to this, there isn't, so this is the first trace that we've got. Whether there's a status code, by default that's unset. So if you auto-instrument your code, all of your status codes, certainly if you're using a Python application, will bear no relevance to what your HTTP library just did. They will always be unset. So you need to set those, and you can do that in the code. And I'll kind of show part of that later. We've got all our attributes, so we know which host we've come from. And then, somewhere in the attributes down here, we've got the service name. This is probably actually one of the most important things on this screen, because the service name is what's going to help us differentiate where all of these traces have come from. So when we start tracing back, we know what talks to what. And then it shows up in your observability platform. This is a very faded image. Yeah, okay. Color wash is slightly different on the monitor, but there we are. This is Grafana's application observability. What you can just about see at the top here is we've got the service name. It has automatically extracted that from the trace, from this field down here, and gone, oh, okay, I've got a new service. And it started, you can just about see, there's like a little hump there, to pull out whether there's any errors, what the rate is of the requests, what the duration is of the requests. And it started doing that automatically based on the information in the trace, right? So this is great. We've run these commands, and we're putting stuff in, and we're happy. So let's make it a bit more interesting. So this, why is that going one line at a time? Okay, cool. This is some wonderful Python. Oh, that was some wonderful Python. There we are, it's back. Where we are calling out to a third-party API and retrieving the JSON. And if the state of the maker space, this is a hack space I run in the UK, there's a thing called space directory for hack spaces. It's a JSON schema document that tells you how many people are in the building, what your sensors are doing, whether the space is open or not, and most spaces will have this somewhere on their website. So it's a really handy one to be able to just hook into. So we're doing a call out with requests library, and we're saying, yeah, we want the JSON, and we want to iterate over it, and we want to set a variable, and then we just want to return some horrible HTML code because I couldn't be bothered to write a Django template for it, and just dump that straight to the screen. And we're also instrumenting. So again, this image is really washed out, and if I'd known that, I would have used a different resolution. However, what we've got up here is we've got our first GET request for the space data, and what you can't see, but we'll be able to in the slides, is that we've actually got the return from that. And in here is all of the request attributes and all of the timings that it's taken for that to be processed. And I can only apologize for the quality of the image. But all that that's telling us on that screen, and you'll have to take my word for it, is that it's just telling us, yeah, we called out to something and we got a response, and it took this long. It doesn't give us any indication as to kind of where that thing was, how we called out to it, or anything like that. So how do we get the more interesting information out of this? How do we get the stuff that, I mean, App Dynamics and others have had for years, those lovely little maps, because we can't get a map off that trace at the moment. Right? Well, we do this. So within our Django code, we've added 2 lines. We've got the Django instrumenter, which has given us the stuff we've got already, right? We know that we ran a call out. And then we've got this, which says, okay, we want to start instrumenting the database calls. And then we initialize them. Again, I apologize for the quality of the image. However, what we have here is actually 3 select statements as a trace. So on this side, what you can't see is a call to the application that's gone off and queried the database. That's then run through the stack. And in here, it will actually show you the query that was run against the database, how long that took to execute, and how quickly it came back. And we've got that from the auto-instrumentation. Just by adding those couple of lines about our Postgres driver, it's immediately started querying Django and saying, okay, what are you actually doing when you query the database? So let's get some more information about that request that we made to the Hackspace API. So now we're importing a trace, and we're setting a trace, and we're starting a trace, and we're setting a kind of client. Now this is really important. When you auto-instrument stuff in Python, and as I say, I can't speak for the other languages, but certainly for Python, it automatically assumes that pretty much everything is a server. What that means is you've got a load of servers and no clients. Which means when you come to draw a map, or when you get your system to draw a map of this stuff, it assumes that everything is a little service on its own, and none of them are connected because they're all servers. So we have to specify, and this is where we start to move away from the auto-instrumentation, right? We have to say this is a client. So now we know that we're a client talking to a server, and it will be able to reach out to that server and it will understand the logic. And then we're setting an attribute here of a peer service. Space name is being called from the database, and then dash space dash API, because that's what I decided to name it. This could be anything, but this is how easy it is to set those attributes. Just span set attribute name, blah. Grafana application observability knows nothing about any of these. I haven't told it a thing. It's inferred all of this from the trace data. All right? That one there, which you can just about see has got a little Python symbol next to it, is the one that is actually sending the data and it knows about it. But because we've said, oh, and by the way, there's a client here, and because we've said we want you to go off and look at the database, it's also said, oh, okay, well, basic OTEL is the name of the database service, so I've found that through the traces. And then make monmouth dash space dash API is the service that I configured here with the peer service. And it goes, oh, okay, great. Well, I know what those look like. And I know that these are different services. And I can track the duration and the errors and the rate across all of those. And better than that, I can actually draw them into a little picture. And I can put lines going between them, because now I know that this, the initial service, is a client of these services here. As I say, you won't get that map unless you start adding the attributes for the peer services and things like that. The peer service attribute is what we use within Grafana Cloud. It may be that whatever you're using uses a different attribute to do that mapping of the service name. So just read the documentation of whatever it is you're doing. And that's great for service calls to the database and service calls to HTTP endpoints, but not everyone's using that, right? Sometimes we're using MQTT to move stuff. Sometimes we're dealing with robots and ROS2, which is the robot operating system, which has its own entire message bus protocol that nobody uses other than ROS2. So how do we deal with that? Well, we can inject information into the payload that we're doing, right? And as long as you inject this, as long as we inject the trace parent and the trace state, then we're good. But injecting that can be a real pain because you don't always know what the trace parent is and pulling it out of things and all the rest of it. So we have something called a propagator, right? Now we are moving well away from the auto-instrumentation, right? So in the blue box here, I've got the client, if you like, all right? And this is automatically adding to the payload the span details on this line here. So we set up our thing. This is for a robot arm I'm building at home. And basically you say, hey, this is the message I want you to send to the arm itself. And I want you to move this particular servo, this particular motor to this particular location. And because I could, I decided I wanted to put a trace on that. And so we're adding the angles of various things. And then at the bottom, we're saying inject the payload. And then at the other side, and we're publishing the message. On the other side of the connection, we're listening for that. And we're pulling the context out of the payload, attaching it, and saying, OK, start a new span. And we're setting this as the consumer. And this one is the producer. Okay? What this means is that it will then draw a map in Grafana Observability or whatever other tool it is you're using that actually says, hey, your control software told the servos to move to this position. Your robot arm received that command, and it then moved them like this. And I've actually got that as an application trace running through. All right? But the context injection, the propagation, will work with just about any kind of payload. JSON is easiest. Anyway, I'm getting in the way of people's beer. I'm getting very close to time. So I'll touch on this now. Is Open Telemetry the cure for vendor lock-in? Well, kind of. It's close, right? There are areas of Open Telemetry that still need work. Front-end observability, so how well is your JavaScript performing and what are your page load times and things like that, is still relatively early on, right? It still needs work there. So you can kind of use Open Telemetry for that, but there are better tools out there at the moment, right? There's always going to be the decision about how and where you store your data. Do you run an open source stack yourself and have full control of it, but understand the costs involved in that? Or do you hand it off to a third-party vendor? Do you do a mix of the two? Well, Open Telemetry allows you to do all of those things, but once your data is in a particular format and in a particular data store, how do you get it out again? And if that data store belongs to a vendor, then you're probably kind of locked in unless you can find a way of exporting your data, right? I said at the beginning that a lot of what I do with OTEL and a lot of the reasons why I was advocating for this before I came to Grafana was about choice. For me, it still is. I don't know of another set of libraries you can embed in your application that allows you to talk to just about any vendor out there. When I was doing the comparisons, Grafana almost always came out on top. As a result, when I applied for the job at Grafana, found out I had it and said to my colleagues, I'm leaving. And they said, where are you going? And I said, Grafana. Literally no one was surprised. It's the only time I've ever had anyone, instead of saying congratulations, went, of course you are. Where else would you go? But the point is that Open Telemetry does allow you to use Grafana, and I'd love you all to use Grafana, and I know a lot of you are using Grafana, but it does allow you to use other people's tools as well. And it doesn't restrict you. It's when you start storing that data now, that is where the lock-in starts, right? It's no longer when you're collecting the data, it's no longer the agent that you're using, it's no longer the language you're using to format those pipelines and to do all the data augmentation and things like that, right? It's the point at which you start storing the data that you get locked in. So OTEL isn't a cure. but it can get you pretty close. So to sum up then, that was a very quick ride through what it's like to get started with Open Telemetry. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone or talk at anyone that will listen about this stuff. If you're not using OTEL already, I'd really recommend that you do. And if you're thinking about doing tracing, because you're only doing metrics and logs at the minute, seriously, use OTEL. At the moment, it is the way that everyone is heading, and I'm pretty confident you'll thank me for it later. That's it from me. Grafana do have a party this evening, along with just about everybody else. We're on the rooftop of 10 Barrel Brewery. It's about a 5-minute walk away. If you want to join us, please scan the QR code. I think it works from a distance, or visit this wonderfully long URL at the bottom. Sign up, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you there. But thank you very much.